The battle was already lost by every measurable standard the galaxy had ever trusted, because the enemy fleet filled the sky like a moving continent of steel and fire, their ships blotting out stars, their formations perfect, disciplined, merciless, while the coalition's remaining forces drifted in broken lines, shields failing, weapons overheating, crews exhausted beyond fear, beyond hope, and beyond belief that survival was still possible. And inside command chambers across dozens of allied species, there was only the quiet acceptance that history was about to record another extinction, another surrender, another footnote explaining how the strong endured and the weak disappeared, because that was how the galaxy had always worked. For centuries, wars had followed predictable equations: numbers, firepower, resources, morale. But today, every equation had collapsed, and no one could deny it anymore. The coalition was outmatched, surrounded, and seconds away from annihilation. Admirals stared at tactical maps they already knew were meaningless. Politicians prepared speeches that would never be broadcast, and entire civilizations braced for occupation, slavery, or erasure, all while one unspoken truth hovered in every mind like a forbidden thought. There was only one remaining option left, and no one wanted to be the one to say it out loud. Because calling them meant admitting desperation. Calling them meant inviting something uncontrollable into a war that was already spiraling beyond reason. Calling them meant trusting a species the galaxy had spent generations fearing, avoiding, and quietly preparing contingencies against, not because they were the strongest or the most advanced, but because their history showed something far worse: unpredictability born from survival, violence tempered by discipline, and a willingness to endure losses that would shatter any other civilization's will. Humans were not mythological monsters, not unstoppable conquerors, yet every major power kept secret files on them, buried beneath classification levels that required unanimous consent to access. Because whenever humans entered a conflict, wars did not merely end, they concluded permanently. Entire doctrines had been written around one simple directive: never corner humanity, never humiliate them, and above all, never force them to fight for survival. Because the galaxy had learned, slowly, painfully, that humans did not escalate wars, they adapted to them, and adaptation was far more dangerous than raw strength. In the coalition's central command ring, orbiting a dying star, the debate finally surfaced, trembling and uncertain at first, then louder, sharper, until it filled the chamber like static before a storm. Some argued it was too late, that humans would never arrive in time, that calling them now would only expand the casualty list. Others whispered the truth no one wanted to face, that humans had already predicted this outcome years ago, that they had warned the coalition quietly, without threats or demands, that the enemy's expansion patterns mirrored conflicts humanity itself had once fought on Earth, long before they reached the stars, and that ignoring those warnings had been a mistake born of arrogance. Records resurfaced of past encounters where humans had intervened reluctantly, decisively, and without spectacle, leaving behind battlefields stripped not just of enemies, but of the will to ever fight again. The room fell silent when an old strategist finally spoke the words that felt heavier than surrender. If we do nothing, we die. If we call them, the war changes. The call was not ceremonial. There were no grand speeches, no dramatic appeals to shared values or galactic unity. It was a simple transmission, encrypted across channels humanity alone monitored, sent from a trembling hand that understood history would judge this moment more harshly than defeat itself. Coordinates, enemy composition, a single sentence added at the end, stripped of pride or authority. We cannot stop them. For several agonizing minutes there was no response, and those minutes felt longer than the entire war combined, because silence from humanity was never reassuring. It meant calculation, evaluation, and decision. When the reply finally arrived, it did not come from a politician or a council, but from a calm, measured human military voice that asked only one question: do you authorize full engagement? No promises, no reassurances, just consequences implied so clearly that the chamber felt colder by several degrees. Authorization was granted unanimously because there was nothing left to lose, and in that instant, the war everyone believed was already over took its first real breath. Human fleets did not arrive dramatically. There was no hyperspace shockwave, no grand formation meant to inspire hope. Instead, human vessels appeared exactly where the enemy was weakest, inside blind zones, along logistics corridors, near command relays that had never been targeted before. Ships of varied design and age, unified not by aesthetics but by purpose. Their presence detected only seconds before systems across the enemy armada began to fail in quiet, cascading patterns that confused analysts and terrified commanders. Coalition observers watched in disbelief as enemy supply ships vanished without explosions, communications fractured into isolated pockets, and command vessels reported sensor ghosts that behaved like hunters rather than machines, because humans were not meeting the enemy head-on. They were dismantling the idea of a battle altogether. This was not reinforcement, this was a takeover of tempo. And for the first time since the war began, the enemy hesitated, not because they were outgunned, but because they could no longer understand the battlefield. And in that hesitation, something fundamental shifted across the galaxy. The coalition realized that the battle they believed was lost had never truly begun, not until the one species everyone feared was finally allowed to fight on its own terms. Because humans did not see wars as contests of power, but as systems to be broken, behaviors to be predicted, and decisions to be forced. And once humans entered a conflict, the question was no longer who would win, but how much of the enemy would be left to remember why they should never have started it in the first place.
The enemy did not realize they were losing at first, because humans never announced victory, never rushed forward in overwhelming displays of force, and never gave their opponents the emotional clarity of a direct confrontation. Instead, confusion spread through enemy command like a slow infection. Reports contradicting one another, sensor data refusing to align, captains arguing with artificial intelligences that insisted nothing was wrong, even as entire battle groups slipped out of formation and vanished from tactical overlays, because the humans were not destroying fleets, they were dissolving coherence. Supply convoys arrived empty, reinforcement signals looped endlessly without response. Long-range weapons failed to lock onto targets that behaved less like ships and more like intent, appearing only long enough to be felt rather than seen. And for a species that had built its identity around dominance, momentum, and psychological intimidation, this silence was unbearable. They had planned for resistance, for desperation, even for heroic last stands, but not for an enemy that refused to be dramatic, refused to posture, and refused to confirm its presence until the damage was already irreversible. Inside the enemy's highest command strata, panic took a new form, not fear of death, but fear of irrelevance, because every strategic doctrine they had relied upon was being rendered obsolete in real time. Humans did not contest territory, they isolated it. Humans did not destroy infrastructure, they repurposed it. Human cyber units infiltrated networks that were believed to be biologically incompatible, not by brute force, but by patiently studying the logic behind alien systems, understanding how their creators thought, and then gently encouraging catastrophic mistakes. Enemy commanders began issuing orders that contradicted one another, chasing phantom threats while real vulnerabilities were exploited elsewhere. And the more aggressively they responded, the more predictable they became, because humans were watching patterns, not positions. Coalition observers slowly realized the truth with a mixture of awe and terror. This was not a counterattack, it was behavioral warfare, a method humans had refined long before leaving their home world, when survival depended not on strength, but on understanding the mind of the opponent better than the opponent understood themselves. As days stretched into what felt like eternities, stories began circulating among enemy crews. Whispers passed through mess halls and encrypted channels about human ships that followed silently for hours without firing, about boarding actions where no alarms were triggered and no bodies were found, only empty corridors and systems left humming as if waiting for their owners to return, about captains who attempted retreat only to discover that their calculated escape routes had already been compromised days earlier. Fear became contagious because humans were no longer perceived as a military force, but as an inevitability, something that arrived not with violence, but with certainty. Entire enemy units began making mistakes that defied logic, firing on friendly signals, abandoning strategic positions, overcommitting resources to defend targets that no longer mattered, while humans simply adjusted, learned, and closed invisible nets that tightened without warning. For the coalition, this phase of the war was deeply unsettling because hope came with a price. Understanding what humans were truly capable of when fully unleashed. Records from human history were revisited with new context. Ancient conflicts, once dismissed as primitive, suddenly revealed patterns eerily similar to what was happening now. Wars where humans had faced extinction and responded not with rage, but with methodical transformation, turning scarcity into innovation, fear into discipline, and loss into a weapon sharper than any blade. The realization spread that humans were not winning because they were angrier or stronger, but because they were more willing to endure uncertainty, more comfortable operating without reassurance, and more dangerous when stripped of illusion. The enemy had entered the war believing humans were prey because they appeared divided and emotional. They were now learning the truth that humanity's greatest strength was not unity in peace, but clarity in crisis. The first true collapse came not with an explosion, but with a surrender that no one had expected. A high-ranking enemy commander transmitted a message across all channels, voice shaking not with humiliation, but with exhaustion, admitting that continued resistance no longer served a strategic purpose because the humans had already neutralized every path to meaningful victory. That message never reached its intended audience. Human systems intercepted it, analyzed it, and delayed its delivery just long enough to dismantle the remaining command infrastructure, ensuring that when the surrender was finally broadcast, it would be uncontested, irreversible, and undeniable. This was mercy by human standards, ending the war cleanly rather than allowing it to decay into endless suffering, and yet, to the enemy, it felt like the final confirmation that they were no longer in control of their own fate. By the time the galaxy began to understand what was happening, the war's outcome was no longer in question. The only uncertainty left was how deeply this lesson would be carved into collective memory, because humans were not content to win battles, they reshaped the rules that defined conflict itself. And as enemy forces retreated into silence, hiding behind treaties, ceasefires, and diplomatic language that suddenly felt very fragile, one truth echoed across every surviving fleet and every watching civilization. Calling humanity had not saved the coalition from defeat, it had transformed defeat into something far worse for the enemy, something permanent.
When the war finally ended, there were no celebrations, no grand speeches broadcast across the stars, and no human fleets parading through conquered systems, because humanity did not see the outcome as a victory to be enjoyed, but as a responsibility to be managed. And that difference unsettled the galaxy more than any display of force ever could. Human commanders withdrew their ships with deliberate calm, restoring disrupted trade routes, reopening communication relays, and stabilizing regions that had been turned into strategic voids during the conflict, while refusing territorial claims that other species would have seized without hesitation, sending a clear and unsettling message. Humans had not fought to rule, they had fought to ensure they would never be hunted again. The enemy species, once feared across countless systems, was left intact but transformed, stripped not of existence but of certainty, forced to confront the psychological weight of having faced an opponent that chose restraint after proving it no longer needed to. In diplomatic chambers across the galaxy, human representatives spoke softly and precisely, their words carrying a gravity earned not through threats but through demonstrated capability. And when they explained the terms of peace, there was no room for negotiation, not because humans demanded obedience, but because every clause was supported by the quiet understanding of what had already been accomplished without cruelty. The enemy's fleets were reduced not by destruction, but by irrelevance, their doctrines archived as historical warnings, their once feared reputation fading into something more unsettling, a reminder of what happens when a species mistakes empathy for weakness. Observers from neutral civilizations began rewriting their cultural assessments of humanity, deleting classifications that labeled humans as emotionally unstable or strategically inferior, replacing them with descriptions that were far more difficult to quantify: adaptive under pressure, cooperative under threat, and terrifyingly patient when survival was at stake. Among humans themselves, the war became something rarely discussed in public, not out of shame, but out of instinctive restraint, because they understood that obsession with power was the fastest way to lose control of it. Veterans returned to ordinary lives, engineers dismantled emergency infrastructures, and analysts archived strategies with strict safeguards, ensuring that what had been unleashed would not become habitual. And yet, beneath this calm exterior, every human knew that a threshold had been crossed, a line drawn so clearly that it would never fade. Humanity had learned not only how to fight the galaxy, but how to end a war without becoming what it opposed, and that knowledge carried a quiet burden that no other species could fully understand. Far beyond human space, in regions that had once considered Earth an easy target, new myths began to form, told in hushed tones to younglings and cadets alike. Stories not of monstrous humans or unstoppable weapons, but of a species that watched, waited, and remembered. Predatory cultures rewrote their training doctrines, not to teach how to hunt humans, but how to avoid provoking them, emphasizing caution, diplomacy, and distance, because the greatest fear was no longer annihilation, but attention. To be noticed by humanity, to become a subject of their focused silence, was now understood as the beginning of an end that arrived without spectacle and without mercy. In the final analysis, the galaxy came to accept a truth it had resisted for centuries. Humans were never prey, not because they were the strongest, but because they were capable of choosing restraint until restraint was no longer viable. What others called hesitation was calculation. What others dismissed as emotion was empathy sharpened into awareness. And what others believed to be division was diversity refined into resilience. The war did not teach humans how to dominate the stars. It taught the stars why humanity should never be forced to try. And so the lesson endured, passed from system to system, generation to generation, not as a warning carved in blood, but as a quiet understanding etched into history itself. When humans decide to stop holding back, the galaxy does not burn, it changes permanently, and no one ever looks at Earth the same way again.